Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got something different for you today. Today, I'd like to talk about cryptozoology, more specifically, Bigfoot. Bigfoot goes by many different names. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Wildman, Yeti, you name it. There's different names for every culture across our planet. Today, I'd like to talk about specifically Bigfoot in California. And that's the title of today's episode, Bigfoot in California. I've collected well over a few hundred cases, but I'm going to pick out just the best, ones that I think are the most credible, the ones that have something interesting to say about the nature of Bigfoot, the ones that are unusual in some way. And I can tell you that the evidence for Bigfoot is outstanding. It's not just eyewitness testimonies, though there are a lot of that. There is physical evidence. There are many cases involving Bigfoot tracks, footprints, many cases involving hair samples, many cases involving dung samples and urine samples and blood samples, many cases involving animal reactions, cases in which Bigfoot has been recorded in terms of sound recordings, also, of course, films and photographs. So the evidence is really quite conclusive, I think. There are many theories as to what this is, and we'll get into that in a bit. I am absolutely convinced it's real because I did have my own encounter, which I would like to talk about at some point during this episode. But these cases stretch back hundreds of years. Bigfoot has appeared all over California, from the redwoods and the sequoias in the northern part of the state, down to the Central Valley, all the way to the deserts of Palmdale and Acton and Lancaster and Mojave, down to as far south as San Diego. So California is actually one of the leading producers of Bigfoot. In fact, according to researchers, California probably does have the highest population of Bigfoot of all the other states. And in fact, Lauren Coleman writes, and I quote, "It has been estimated that the population of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest is between 2,000 and 4,000 individuals, with the greatest concentration around Bluff Creek, California." But again, these cases come from all across the state. I've got about 100 that I'd like to share with you today, 100 of what I think are the best cases. So let's just get started. As it turns out, some of the earliest records of Bigfoot's existence come from California. Native Americans in the state have long reported the creature and have given it many names. They have a long oral tradition talking about Bigfoot. But starting in the 1850s, gold prospectors and miners reported sightings in such areas as Antioch, Round Valley, and San Joaquin. One early report was made by a gold prospector in the Mount Shasta area who claimed that a Bigfoot smashed his sluiceway against a tree. It was around this time that a series of alleged murders outside the Southern California city of San Marcos were actually blamed on Bigfoot. The actual location was a remote valley called Deadman's Hole, and in 1858, an unidentified man was found beaten to death in this area, and in 1870, a Frenchman said that he was attacked in his cabin by a tall, hairy creature. In 1888, two more badly crushed bodies were discovered in this area, and on that same year, two hunters came upon a cave filled with human bones, and they said that as they were examining these bones, they were attacked by a tall, hairy, man-like ape creature with a human-looking face. They shot at the creature and then ran away in a panic. And there were two additional unexplained deaths which occurred as late as 1922, and later more hunters again claimed that they confronted a hostile Bigfoot which ran away when they opened fire on it. Now these cases are quite controversial. As far as I can tell, there are no other cases like this, so I am not sure how much credence to put towards them, Since then, no further deaths have been reported, and I'm just not sure that we should be worried about Bigfoot, doing this kind of behavior. So those cases remain unique in the literature, but I mentioned them for what they're worth. But meanwhile, the early sightings in the mid to late 1980s began to grow quickly in number. In the autumn of 1869, a hunter was hunting along Orristimba Creek when he saw a Bigfoot approach his campfire, grab some of the burning sticks, and start swinging them around. And it was the next year, 1870, when numerous residents of the Mount Diablo area reported a, quote, wild man in the area, which left 13-inch tracks. One really dramatic encounter occurred in 1882 in the Owens Valley. This is more central California. Several people had reported seeing a large, hairy, bipedal creature in the area, and several men decided to go hunting for it. And incredibly, they found the creature lying down asleep in a field and attempted to capture it. One of the gentlemen, his name was John Clark, and he reports that he tried to lasso the creature, but it woke up and ran away screaming. His associate, Paul Mertongreen, fainted unconscious when the creature turned and charged him. Hunter John Farrell followed the creature and a few days later came upon it while it was feeding. He says he fired 5 bullets into this creature, but the shots seemed to have no effect. At this point, it charged him, causing his horse to panic and gallop away. The horse ended up breaking both its front legs. Farrell himself was badly bruised, and not surprisingly, the Bigfoot got away. So there were scattered accounts occurring throughout the Northern California area at this time, but few people seemed to really believe or pay attention to these accounts. The local Native Americans, however, were well aware of Bigfoot and began to reveal some of their encounters too. For example, in the summer of 1897, a Native American who lived in Tule Lake reported that he was approached by a Bigfoot while he was fishing. He offered Bigfoot one of the fish, which it accepted. And in fact, the Native Americans do report other friendly Bigfoot encounters. In the early 1900s, a native of Mount Shasta reports that he was hiking in the wilderness when he was bitten by a poisonous snake, and to his surprise, he was approached by a Bigfoot which actually lifted him up and carried him back to his camp. So in the 1900s, these accounts really began to grow in number. In 1938, a gentleman from Los Angeles went camping outside of Anza Borrego in Southern California. This is a desert area. And he says he was approached by several hostile, white-haired Bigfoot with reddish eyes. He says he was able to keep the creatures at a distance by building up his campfire and holding up the burning brands. So while Bigfoot encounters can be scary, they rarely harm humans. There are not a lot of cases of that. People do get scared, but they generally do not hurt people. Some cases, however, definitely push the limits of this. During World War II, 2 friends, O.R. Edwards and Bill Cole, say that they were hunting in the Siskiyou Mountains when they had an unforgettable encounter with a Bigfoot. Now today there are several accounts of people being actually kidnapped by Bigfoot, and this one is one of the earliest on record. The 2 hunters had walked around some bushes when they suddenly saw the head of an ape-like creature dart out of the woods and look at them. It darted back in, and in a matter of seconds they heard this Bigfoot running towards them. And Cole says he was attacked. As Edward says, "I heard the pad, pad, pad of running feet and the whump and grunt as their bodies came together. Dashing back to the end of the bush, I saw a large man-like creature covered with brown hair. It was about 7 feet tall, and it was carrying in its arms what seemed like a man. I could only see legs and shoes." Edwards looked to his side and saw that his friend Cole was gone, and that's when he realized this Bigfoot had just kidnapped his friend. And Cole himself reports that he had no warning whatsoever, but suddenly found himself being carried through the forest by the creature, which held him tightly for a short time, and then dropped him and sent him rolling down the hill. He jumped up and grabbed his rifle, and as he says, and I quote, "I stood there some time and looked and listened. I had a feeling I was being watched and hunted." So these two gentlemen kept this encounter secret for many years, because as Edwards says, I would not believe what I had seen. And as Cole says, it was funny. Neither of us had the guts to say what happened to us. It's not the only case of a Bigfoot kidnapping, but it's one of few that occurred in California. But as time went on, accounts of Bigfoot really began to increase in number. In 1947, Mr. and Mrs. Russ Tribble said that they observed two Bigfoot outside the city of Round Mountain. They said that the Bigfoot actually crossed the road in front of them, and one of them stopped and looked in the car window. And after these creatures left, they explored the area and discovered large footprints. In 1952, just a short time later, an anonymous gentleman was driving along a dirt road through the forest outside of Orleans. This is near Bear Valley, California, and he saw a Bigfoot walking alongside the road. Although it was rainy and dark, he got out of his car to observe closer, and this Bigfoot turned towards him in what he perceived to be a threatening way, but the creature then walked back into the forest. He thought the encounter was over at this point, but it wasn't. He got back in his car and started to drive when the Bigfoot leapt out of the forest and attacked his car. He accelerated away, but he says that the Bigfoot held onto his car for about 200 yards before finally letting go. So yeah, they can be quite aggressive at times. One of the most common types of Bigfoot encounters occurs when witnesses are driving late at night. And in 1956, Mrs. Pomeray was driving along Interstate 5 near Mount Shasta when she saw Bigfoot run across the road and disappear into the forest. Mount Shasta has a lot of Bigfoot accounts. But the first encounter to really gain any widespread media attention and really bring Bigfoot permanently into the public awareness occurred in August of 1958 in the town of Bluff Creek. This is in Northern California. And what happened was a large construction crew was building the Bluff Creek Road when strange things began to occur on the job site. On August 3rd, 1958, the foreman, Wilbur Wallace, was puzzled to find that a 700-pound tire had been thrown away from the work site. He couldn't explain it, but didn't think much of it until a few weeks later, on August 22nd, when one of the crew workers, Jerry Crew, was leaving the work site when he discovered dozens of giant man-like footprints around his tractor. He told Wilbur Wallace, and the news of the footprints spread like wildfire. The news was soon leaked to the press by the wife of one of the workers. And then, on October 1st and 2nd, Jerry Crew discovered more tracks, and this time he made plaster casts. And this was enough to make this story an instant media sensation, and the attention of the world was focused on the then little-known town of Bluff Creek. And the encounters were still in progress. On October 12, two workers, Ray Kerr and Bob Brazel, were driving at night near Bluff Creek when they saw an 8-foot-tall figure run across the road in full view of their headlights. This figure, they said, was very hairy and actually traversed the entire road in only 2 strides. Just a few days or weeks later, on November 1st, 1958, more footprints were discovered. Later, there would be allegations that Wilbur Wallace had either hoaxed the footprints or tried to take financial advantage of the situation, though this was never proven in any way. In either case, Bluff Creek became firmly established as the Bigfoot capital of the world, And as a result, hundreds of people began to share their own accounts. Reporting Bigfoot had finally become somewhat respectable, or credible at least, and Bigfoot hunters converged on Bluff Creek and began what turned out to be a never-ending search for the elusive creature. And since then, Bigfoot was reported pretty much every year. In 1958, a woman and her daughter were outside in the Hoopa Valley area, this is near Bluff Creek, when they said they saw two Bigfoot, one large and one small, as they were hiking along the hillside. And at the same time, in nearby Weaverville, two doctors were driving along Highway 299 late at night when they had the most common type of Bigfoot encounter. They observed the creature through the car headlights as it bounded across the road in front of them. 1 year later, June of 1959, an anonymous gentleman became sleepy after driving for several hours. He decided to pull over late at night outside of the town of Weed, California, and while resting, he was alerted to the noise of somebody walking through the forest in front of his car. He turned on the headlights and observed a Bigfoot, which quickly disappeared into the forest. That same year, 1959, a private pilot and his wife were flying over Bluff Creek when they spotted a trail of huge footprints on the ground. So they followed the tracks from above and further ahead were amazed to see the Bigfoot that was making these tracks. So while all these sightings were occurring, dozens of other witnesses were reporting Bigfoot tracks all over the area. And in some of these cases, they counted the tracks and they numbered well over 1,000. So the Bluff Creek sightings would continue for decades, and even today this area continues to produce the largest number of reports in California. But meanwhile, sightings continued all across the state. In 1960, two men in Quartz Hill, this is located at the west end of the Antelope Valley in Southern California, they observed what appeared to be a giant bipedal figure silhouetted against the sky on a nearby hill. Mount Shasta, as I mentioned, is one of the many lairs of Bigfoot. A lot of cases come from there. In 1962, a unique encounter occurred when a local woman by the name of Bonnie Feldman claimed to have observed a pregnant female Bigfoot give birth to a baby Bigfoot on the mountainside. She says she watched the event from the porch of her trailer on the eastern slopes of the mountain. So I think that case may be unique, but there are so many cases. In June of 1962, Robert Hadfield was in his home in Fort Bragg when his dogs began barking outside. Looking outside, he saw the head and shoulders of a Bigfoot as it walked behind a 6-foot-tall fence. So this is well over 6 feet tall. He ran inside to get his friend, Bud Jensen. They both returned outside, but by then, the Bigfoot appeared to be gone. It wasn't. Jensen returned back inside, but Hatfield kept looking. He then walked around the house and right smack into the Bigfoot. The creature actually knocked him to the ground, and terrified, he scrambled back into the house. Meanwhile, Jensen looked out the window and observed the Bigfoot approaching the front door that Hatfield had left open. He ran up to close it, but the Bigfoot also ran forward and actually held it open. The two men got ready to shoot the creature if it entered, but at this point it suddenly left. They found a handprint on the door, which they said measured 11.5 inches long. And they also found several footprints outside, which upon measuring, they found were 16 inches in length. So far bigger than any human. And the sightings continued. It was just 2 months later, August 10, 1962, when Joseph Wattenberger was hiking east of McLeod, this is near Lava Beds National Monument, when he observed a Bigfoot off in the distance. And while some accounts of Bigfoot do have a menacing aspect to them, some are absolutely benevolent. Here's an interesting case which occurred 1 year later in 1963. A man says he was deer hunting on the slopes of Mount Shasta when he slipped and fell, badly injuring himself. And he says that a 9-foot tall, very smelly, white-haired Bigfoot appeared, scooped him up in its massive arms, and carried him about 3 miles back to the safety of his campsite. Another weird and friendly account of a Bigfoot occurred on Mount Shasta when 2 men said a Bigfoot approached their campsite, came right up to them with no fear, and actually handed them a quartz crystal and then bounded off into the forest. So there are weird accounts of sort of trades going on between Bigfoot and people. Many Bigfoot encounters do involve multiple witnesses of high credibility. On January 27, 1963, the police department in Sonora, California, received a call from an anonymous gentleman who said that he saw Bigfoot while driving along the Sonora highway. A sheriff and a deputy went to investigate, and they became witnesses themselves. They didn't actually see the Bigfoot, but they could hear it screaming in the woods. 1 month later, February 28, 1963, private pilots Leonard Strand and Alden Hoover were flying through this same area when they came upon what they believed to be a 10-foot tall, brown-haired Bigfoot wandering through a remote area of the wilderness. They were able to actually take photos of this being, this Bigfoot, but the photos didn't turn out very well. They were too blurry to be conclusive. But the sightings continued. It was just 1 month later, March 1963. Mr. and Miss Campbell were honeymooning at a ski lodge in Strawberry, California. Unknown to them, the owners of the ski lodge had recently had several run-ins with Bigfoot, and as the Campbells were hiking along the many remote trails in this area, they were amazed to see a tall, hairy figure, which they estimate was about 9 feet tall, in the nearby fields. After reporting it, they later learned that they were not the only witness to what appears to be the same Bigfoot. So despite its enormous size, Bigfoot is incredibly agile. On August 3rd, 1963, a father and his son from Hoopa, California, observed a Bigfoot running through the field, and it easily leapt over a 5-foot-high fence and ran off into the forest. 1 year later, September 13, 1964, Benjamin Wilder was driving near Blue Lake, this is in Northern California, and he became sleepy and pulled over his car to rest, and he woke up to find a Bigfoot shaking his car. Shortly later, the Bigfoot ran off, and he immediately drove away. But 1 month later, in the Southern California city of Fillmore, several youngsters were playing in an abandoned dairy when they said that they observed a, quote, hairy animal man. So Bigfoot does seem to approach people purposefully on sometimes. They seem to be attracted to people's campsites. And a typical encounter like this occurred in the summer of 1965 when Jim and Jan Gorel were barbecuing at the Bowens Ranch campgrounds on San Gorgonio Mountain when they were approached by a 10-foot tall Bigfoot which calmly observed them from a distance. The girls became very nervous, too nervous to remain there, and quickly packed up everything and left. And while reports of people being harmed by Bigfoot are exceedingly rare, there's something about the appearance of this creature that often makes people react with fear. It was 2 a.m. in January of 1966 when Bob Kelly and Archie Bradshaw, who were good friends, were in their cabin in Wildwood. They had no warning when a Bigfoot suddenly appeared and stared at them through the window. Kelly grabbed his shotgun and fired at the creature, and although he was sure he hit it, it ran away. They went outside and measured its tracks at 18 inches in length. In July and August of 1966, Several Bigfoot reports came from the Southern California city of Fontana. This was a huge wave of sightings. One family reported that a tall, red-haired Bigfoot actually ransacked their car while they were picnicking. Around that time, 2 teenage boys were hiking outside Fontana when they said a Bigfoot actually attacked them. The Bigfoot grabbed one of the boys, who suffered scratches and torn clothing as a result. Another rare Bigfoot attack occurred in the same area. This was on August 27. The witness was Jerry Mendahal and a friend. They said they saw Bigfoot from their car. To their shock, the Bigfoot quickly approached, reached through the car window, and grabbed the arm of one of the witnesses, causing painful scratches. Both the witnesses report that the Bigfoot was covered with slimy mud and emitted a foul, putrid odor. Corroborating all these above encounters, around the same time, 2 young men were hiking in nearby Quartz Hill when they observed a Bigfoot standing still on a distant hilltop. So by this time it was becoming clear to researchers that not only was Northern California a Bigfoot hotspot, Southern California was also producing a large number of cases. Still, the vast forests in Northern California with the towering sequoias and redwood trees seems to be the preferred Bigfoot habitat. In 1966, Richard Sides was hiking near Bluff Creek when he saw a Bigfoot squatting down, drinking water with its cupped hands. In 1966, same year, Larry Browning was camping in the Trinity Alps outside of Weaverville when he said he saw a Bigfoot walk by his campsite. The Trinity Alps do produce a large number of cases, but Larry Browning was so amazed that he returned to his campsite several times in the hopes of having another sighting, and his patience was finally rewarded. However, he learned the hard way that it's not always a good idea to get too close to Bigfoot, because it was 2 years later, on April 6, 1968, he observed a Bigfoot wading across the Salmon River. He returned the next day and saw a female Bigfoot, but on this occasion, the Bigfoot also saw him and began to chase him. And he says that this Bigfoot actually followed him for a half hour, and at one point charged him menacingly before finally going away. There are quite a few reports like that in the Bigfoot literature of these creatures charging people and trying to basically chase them out of the area. In early 1967, Russell Somerville was again on Highway 299. This is just west of Willow Creek, when he observed a 9-foot-tall Bigfoot walking right along the highway. He says this creature stayed parallel to the highway for about 50 feet before dashing back into the undergrowth. And he says afterwards there was a terrible odor which lingered for several minutes. What's interesting about Bigfoot is, yes, there's often this foul odor associated with them, but it's not always there. And some Bigfoot researchers think that they might have a gland in which they can release this odor much in the manner of a skunk. Whether that's true or not is unknown, but it's certainly a lot of speculation about this. Of course, many Bigfoot hunters have mounted various expeditions in search of Bigfoot, and many of these are concentrated around the Bluff Creek area. And one of these included a man by the name of Roger Patterson. He had heard about new Bigfoot prints in the area of Bluff Creek, and in October of 1967, he went to Bluff Creek to make a film documentary about Bigfoot. And this began one of the most influential and controversial events in Bigfoot history. It was October 18, 1967. Roger Patterson and his associate, Robert Gimlin, were riding through the area where footprints had been reported, occasionally taking film footage of the surroundings to use as background material for their film. It was early in the afternoon when they came around a corner on the trail and saw a tall, hairy figure just a few hundred yards away. Roger Patterson quickly retrieved his movie camera and filmed 952 frames of moving film of this creature as it walked away into the forest. And this film became a media sensation and still is today. Controversy surrounds the film. There have been claims of hoaxes. However, the primary witnesses never recanted their stories. Most experts, I think, believe that the film is authentic. Not all. Some believe this is a man in a basically a gorilla suit, if you will. Nevertheless, it is only one of many cases. The story of Bigfoot does not rest on the Patterson film, and Bluff Creek still continues to produce a constant parade of solid reports. For example, in June of 1968, Steve Marlin and Bruce Cornwall were hiking in the Bluff Creek area when they saw and smelled a Bigfoot in a clearing in the forest. 1 month later, July 11, 1968, a family was camping along the Trinity River when they said they saw a Bigfoot walk right by their campsite and back into the forest. That same month, in July of 68, Harold Lancaster was hiking through the Southern California desert outside of Borrego Springs. It was late at night when he says he saw a, quote, giant ape man walking towards him. It then bounded away and disappeared. And although rare, there are a few accounts on record where people have seen Bigfoot from the air while flying. In January of 1969, for example, private pilots Robert James Jr. and Larry Larwick were flying a small plane just over the north area of Yosemite Park when they saw a long line of what looked like Bigfoot tracks. And they were intrigued, so they followed the tracks in their plane. To their amazement, these tracks appeared to be fresh and led them directly to the Bigfoot himself. And they buzzed the creature with their plane, getting as close, they said, as 50 feet to it. They also tried to take photographs and managed to capture blurry photographs of this creature, and they estimated it was about 12 feet tall and that these footprints were about 20 inches long. So many witnesses have made very close-up observations of Bigfoot and have provided really detailed descriptions of their appearance. And a perfect example of this occurred on April 16, 1969 in the town of Paradise, California, which was very much forested. This occurred on to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Beam, and they encountered a Bigfoot crossing the road in front of them. And according to Mr. Robert Beam, he says, and I quote, "As we started a long curve, our headlights lit what seemed to be a man in fur crossing the road. Our impression was that it was more than 6 feet high, completely covered with short black hairs, which seemed to be marked either of white spots or mud. Its face was white. The head was small and finished at a peak at the top. Was heavily built with particularly heavy legs." So that's a typical description. But it was around the same time and in the nearby city of Oroville that Ed Seville and Eldon Butler were rabbit hunting. And to their shock, their rabbit calls actually attracted an 8-foot-tall, green-eyed Bigfoot, which apparently came to investigate the noise they were making. So that's one way to do a CE5 with a Bigfoot. In June of 1969, Ben Foster, Bob Kelly, and his family, and several others were at the Wildwood Inn in Wildwood, and they were drawn outside by the sound of barking dogs. This large group of witnesses observed a 6-foot-tall, dark brown Bigfoot, which was fighting with the dogs that had surrounded it. Bigfoot and dogs generally do not get along, but when these people arrived, the creature ran off into the surrounding forest. But there was a cluster of sightings in this area at that time. It was 1 month later, on July 4, 1969, Eldon Brackett was hiking north of Wildwood when he observed a 7-foot tall Bigfoot. And after it left, he examined the tracks, which measured 16.5 inches, and they had a 4-foot stride. So, clearly not human. It was just 2 weeks later, July 17, two brothers, Charles and Kevin Jackson, were burning rabbit entrails in their backyard in rural Oroville when they observed an 8-foot tall female Bigfoot walk by the nearby outhouse. That same month, Don Ballard and a friend of his were horseback riding through the Trinity Alps when they had a rare daylight sighting of the creature. Most of the sightings are at night. It does appear to be nocturnal, but that's not always the case. But Don Ballard reports that this creature appeared to have no real neck, but it did leave several 16-inch tracks. Most of the witnesses say that Bigfoot has no real neck to speak of, very wide shoulders, extremely muscular. The reports about Bigfoot, particularly in California, are very similar and consistent. It was around this same time, July of 1969, in the same general area, that Homer Stickley observed a Bigfoot walk through his backyard. He lived on the outskirts of Oroville. And in the months that followed, he investigated and he found several tracks measuring about 11 inches. So July of 1969 was a major Bigfoot wave. In the city of Twain, 3 teenagers were driving home from a movie when they observed a Bigfoot crouching in the middle of the road in front of them. They actually had to swerve to avoid it. They came to a screeching stop, and when they turned around to examine, the creature was gone. There are people who have interacted with Bigfoot. One such case occurred to an anonymous female prospector who was working outside of Orleans, California, and she reported that during the summer of 1969, she observed a male and female Bigfoot on several occasions. And after seeing them a number of times, she left out apples and grapes for the creatures, which they apparently took. In the fall of 1969, again the same year, Oroville again showed itself to be a Bigfoot hotspot. Ron Sanders was hiking along the French Creek in Oroville when he saw 2 Bigfoot crossing the reservoir. The Bigfoot were actually turning over large rocks and appeared to be eating something. And it was around that same time when Charles Maudlin was hiking along the nearby Feather River when he saw a Bigfoot running along an abandoned dirt road. I mean, there's so many cases. October 31st, Wes Strong was in his home in Oroville when he saw a Bigfoot squatting in his yard. He says the Bigfoot stared right back at him and was obviously aware that it was being observed. Many people have tried to shoot Bigfoot. Mike Scott and a friend were in Calaveras in the Big Trees National Monument when they saw a Bigfoot about 30 yards away. Mike Scott fired, he says, 3 rounds of ammunition at the creature. It did not appear to affect it. It quickly escaped, apparently unharmed. So sightings continued throughout the 1970s. In April of 1970, Buzz McLaughlin and several others of Hyampom, California, observed a 9-foot tall Bigfoot outside the Manzanita Ranch School. And they said the creature looked very much like a giant gorilla. On May 14, 1970, Archie Buckley was hiking at Stewart Gap south of Wildwood when he observed a 7-foot tall Bigfoot. After it left, he measured its tracks at 15 inches, and he was so awestruck by his experience that he did begin researching accounts and conducting his own Bigfoot stakeouts. And 1 month after this encounter, on June 18, he returned hoping to have another encounter, and he was successful. he was actually able to attract a Bigfoot to his camp by laying out freshly caught fish as an offering. This is one of a number of cases in which people have been able to initiate a Bigfoot encounter. Also in 1970, two hunters were in Cooper Canyon near Quartz Hill. Again, this is in Southern California. There are other cases at Quartz Hill. They were out hunting in the forest when they encountered what they thought at first was a very large unidentified animal. However, when it stood up, they could see it through their gun scopes, and it looked like a large human-looking figure. They weren't sure if this might be a person or an animal, so they didn't shoot, and shortly later this figure ran off into the forest on two legs. So it was definitely bipedal. On September 1, 1971, an anonymous lieutenant sheriff was driving southeast of Mammoth Mountain. This is a very popular ski resort, when he observed an 8-foot-tall hairy Bigfoot standing alongside the roadside with its arms outstretched. It was around that same time, but much farther south in Palmdale, that an anonymous young man says that he encountered Bigfoot, and like other witnesses, he says he shot at it. He fired 4 shots at it with a .30-30 rifle, and as in virtually all the cases where people shoot at this creature, the Bigfoot was apparently unharmed and fled the area. In late 1971 and early 1972, many reports came in from the high Sierras. For example, campers Warren Johnson, Larry Johnson, and Bill McDowell, and others, reported several incidents where Bigfoot would prowl around their campsite, often howling in the distance. And they were actually able to capture some of the vocalizations on audio tape. So there is little doubt that Bigfoot is real and that California is a hot spot. Here's a pretty well-known case, which occurred in January of 1972 to 4 teenage boys from Ball's Ferry. This is an extremely rare type of Bigfoot UFO encounter because the boys were driving when they saw a UFO, a large glowing object, swoop down over their car. They continued driving and parked along Battle Creek, and it was there that they heard a blood-curdling scream. They trained their flashlights on the sound and saw a 7-foot-tall creature covered with brown hair. They became overwhelmed with fear and immediately left the area, but returned shortly later with an adult. And again, all of them heard the creature howling loudly. And again, it scared them off the scene. As the adult witness, Dean Rich, says, it sounded like a real deep growl. It was a real weird type of sensation. It was nothing I've ever experienced before. So there are a number of cases where Bigfoot and UFOs do appear at the same time. There are actually quite a few cases like this across the United States and the world. I did cover those types of cases in a previous episode, but I think it's important to note that there does appear to be, in some cases, a connection between Bigfoot and UFOs. But most, no. Another UFO, or rather another Bigfoot hotspot, is the Angeles National Forest. This is just north of Los Angeles. It has about 650,000 acres, so it's a vast remote wilderness and a haven for all kinds of large wildlife, including bear, deer, cougar, and apparently Bigfoot. So while Northern California Bigfoot sightings are well known, many people are not aware that Southern California has hundreds upon hundreds of reports. And when you take into account that most people never report their encounters, it's likely these accounts are probably in the thousands. And if you just visit the vast mountains of the Angeles Forest covered with thick pine trees, it's enough to convince you that Bigfoot could definitely live there. And in the mid-1970s, the Southern California sightings increased and produced a huge flood of reports. For example, in February of 1972, 4 teenagers were hiking the Lake Isabella area of Southern California when they said they saw a Bigfoot prowling around their campsite in the late moonlight. That same year, October 8, Randy Norton and Steve Gillespie were in the city of Redding when they observed a Bigfoot traverse Clear Creek at the Placer Street Bridge, which you can see right here. The next day, they saw what appeared to be the same Bigfoot in the same area running away. The year of 1973 brought a huge flood of reports in the Lancaster-Palmdale area. On March 14 of that year, 3 U.S. Marines observed what they described as a, quote, large bipedal hairy creature. This was right on the outskirts of Lancaster. And according to the witnesses, they were driving along when this creature actually leapt in front of their car. It was that same month, another woman from Lancaster went outside to see why her dogs were whimpering, and she was shocked to see a tall, hairy, ape-like figure stand up from the tall grass and run off. On April 22nd, 1973, a multiple witness case occurred in the Sycamore Flats campground in Big Rock Canyon. This is near Lancaster again. The 3 witnesses were all from the San Fernando Valley. Their names are William Romerman, Brian Goldojarb, and Richard Engels. They were exploring the area together when each of them observed a hairy man-like creature. It was towering at least 11 feet tall, possibly 12 feet. They got a really good look at it. And according to the witnesses, this creature actually paced their pickup truck along the road for about 20 seconds. They know how tall it was because they saw its head actually sweep right under this overhanging branch. And they were later able to measure the height up to this branch, and it was between 11 and 12 feet. So that's a really well-verified case. 1 month later, Ron Bailey observed an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot standing right next to a telephone pole alongside the road in Palmdale. And after it left, he approached the site and found large footprints. So this area, Palmdale, Lancaster, Acton, is quite active for Bigfoot. Just 1 month later, in June of 1973, siblings Brett and Stephanie Baylor were playing outside their home in Lancaster when they saw Bigfoot observing them from behind a boulder. It was 1 month later, in July, an anonymous naturalist was researching in the Castle Crag mountain area, and he says he observed an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot. It had a very human-looking face, he said. And he watched it for a long time, about 45 minutes. It's interesting because many people do report that although Bigfoot is hairy, the face itself looks remarkably human-like. In August of 1973, Margaret and Joyce Baylor of Lancaster again observed a Bigfoot which they estimate was 12 feet tall, again alongside the road. After it left, they found its footprints. And it was around this same time that a gentleman by the name of Mike Pence was driving his motorcycle through the desert area north of Lancaster when a Bigfoot appeared, and he said threw rocks at his motorcycle. If you study the Bigfoot accounts in the literature, you will see that rock throwing is definitely one of their behaviors. And interestingly, this is a well-known type of primate behavior. Meanwhile, back in Northern California, things were heating up, specifically in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. And as Lauren Coleman, who's a world-famous cryptozoologist, writes, and I quote, "In August 1973, during a fishing trip and other visits, several Bay Area-based Bigfooters, including Sharon Gordon, Richard Foster, Ben E. Foster Jr., and Archie Buckley, had multiple sightings there, including seeing a Bigfoot throw a rock, one prowling around a campfire, another flipping a car aerial, some communicating by gesture, and another being attracted nearby. So they did find tracks, they found a dead fawn, feces, and it was a very active area. Meanwhile, the Bigfoot wave in Southern California continued. September 1973, two people were in their driveway one evening in Quartz Hill. They turned on the headlights to their car and were amazed to see this Bigfoot with long tangled hair standing at the end of their driveway. And after it left, they did find large footprints. In October of that same year, large 21-inch footprints were discovered at the nearby South Fork campground. Measurements taken of the distance between the footprints registered, get this, a 12-foot stride. So this Bigfoot was apparently running, and certainly there's no human being on Earth that can have a stride that wide. That same year, December 27, two siblings were hiking near their home in Palmdale when they saw a Bigfoot which they estimate was about 12 feet tall. As they watched, it bounded away at very high speeds and disappeared into the desert. In 1973, a team of researchers set up a Bigfoot stakeout in the Mojave Desert area near a place called the Buttes. One of them was Kent Lacey, and the other researchers actually achieved their goal of having a Bigfoot encounter when they all observed a large hairy Bigfoot standing off in the distance. And they not only saw it, they smelled it and described it as a powerful, rank odor. In 1974, a family from Quartz Hill was startled by the appearance of Bigfoot in their backyard. So they will come right up to people's homes. Many cases of that and of them looking in people's windows. And that same year, in nearby Big Rock Canyon campground, a number of reports came in. Most of the people who were encountering this creature were campers or hikers or hunters. There was a very famous case in August of 1974, which occurred to Bruce Morgan. He was at the Big Rock area when he saw a shaggy, white-haired Bigfoot sitting down on the ground. And in a sitting position, its height was about 6 feet. So you can see how big these creatures really are. It was around that same time that a gentleman by the name of Terry Albright was driving through the Big Rock area along the mountain roads when he nearly hit a 7-foot-tall black-haired Bigfoot with his car. He went public with his case, which became quite well known. In September of 1974, Neil Fern and Rich Engels were hiking at night in Antelope Valley when they said they saw a 7-foot-tall, black-haired Bigfoot standing on a hilltop. And after it left, they searched the area and found 15-inch footprints. What was really interesting about these footprints is they did not have 5 toes. Instead, they had 3 toes. And that does turn up in a number of these cases. It was just a few months later when a group of children were walking near the Canyon High School in Newhall, Saugus, and this has forested area right around it, and they saw a 9-foot-tall, dark-colored Bigfoot raise its arms and then jump off into the wilderness. So this wave continued strong into 1975. On August 14, Irene Rambo observed a 10-foot-tall Bigfoot appear over her backyard fence in Corona, and it was 3 days later that 4 witnesses, including James Mihalko and Ernest Palmera, were near their home in Corona when they saw what appears to be the same 10-foot-tall Bigfoot wandering through a citrus grove. Further north, in Sequoia National Park, but around the same time, John Clark was camping when he saw a 9-foot-tall Bigfoot, which he said looked like it had blonde hair, or he says could have been covered in vegetation. He's not sure. But most Bigfoot are described as being dark-colored. Occasionally you do hear red hairs, blonde hairs, and rarely white. On September 3rd, 1975, Mark Carr was driving outside the very big hot spot for Bigfoot, Oroville, and in the early morning he saw a 7-foot tall Bigfoot right along the roadside. He was so amazed, he actually lost control of his car and smashed into a tree, and when he looked up, the Bigfoot was gone. In 1975, an anonymous witness was driving outside of Saugus when he saw a Bigfoot, and he said that it was holding a small animal in its hands as it stood in the light of a flashing road sign. There are a number of cases of that, of people seeing Bigfoot holding rabbits, deer, and other animals. Meanwhile, back up in Northern California, near the town of Pine Grove, 2 teenagers, Rick Vandelli and Joe Coughlin, saw a Bigfoot twice over a period of just a few weeks. On March 23rd, 1976, Ed Johnson and a police patrolman by the name of Dan Murphy observed a Bigfoot leap over an 8-foot tall wall. This was in rural Mill Valley, and they investigated the area and found the corpse of a freshly killed deer. So there's so many cases. I'm really just touching the tip of the iceberg here. But I want to continue up to pretty much the present day. In the summer of 1976, 2 brothers were fishing late at night at Moore's Dam when they observed a very tall, human-like creature walking along a deer path. And it was just a few months later that a hunter reported his sighting of the creature along the West Fork River. And in his case, he also heard the Bigfoot scream in a weird mixture of, he said, howling and roaring. 1 year later, 1977, a man was camping in the woods outside of Mendocino. This is central to Northern California. And he says he was woken up by this bipedal creature running through the woods right outside his tent. As he says, and I quote, "I was more effing afraid than I could ever remember, praying that what I was listening to wouldn't start moving towards my tent. The noise sounded like a 2-legged monster crashing through the woods hastily." So he didn't see anything. However, he says that the reports that he says that in the area where he was camping, many disemboweled animals had recently been found. So Bigfoot usually occurs at night. And again, the most common type of encounter is a road crossing, as in this following case. It was late one evening in 1978. A truck driver was driving near Lake Hughes when he observed a very tall, hairy, man-like creature bound across the road in front of his headlights. It was throughout the 1980s and 1990s that Southern California researcher Ann Druffel investigated numerous Bigfoot cases throughout the Tujunga Canyon area. So this is also an area that's very active with UFOs. In fact, Ann Druffel mostly investigated UFOs, but started investigating Bigfoot because, again, there appears to be a connection here. And I investigated a case personally involving a radiologist by the name of Robert Murphy. His home is located on the outskirts of Canyon Country. This is immediately north of the sprawling megalopolis of Los Angeles, but a very rural area. And one summer evening in 1978, Robert Murphy was startled to see an object flashing extremely bright red and white lights landing in his backyard. He first thought it was a helicopter because there was no roads or structures behind his house, but he realized it was totally silent. And he jumped up to go outside, and these lights disappeared. He was very puzzled, but it was the next night that he got a real scare, because as he says, and I quote, "This is the one that gets me. I have 3 dogs, and they were terrified out of their minds. They were huddling together on my patio, all 3 of them. They were huddled together, and they were obviously terrified out of their minds, and they were looking at the same spot where that thing with all the lights was the night before, right in the corner of my yard. They were barking at something up there, and they were barking furiously like they've never done before in their lives. They were all huddled together. And then I heard this creature, and this thing moaned, and it moaned in an unearthly fashion that's very hard to describe, other than it had a very low, long-toned, eerie moan that sounded like it was resonating in a very large creature, like a big, barrel-chested kind of creature. You could just hear the resonance of this thing, and it moaned really long, like 10 seconds. And at this point, Robert Murphy mentioned something that is familiar to Bigfoot researchers, but I don't think most people know about, is that Bigfoot is actually telepathic. As Robert says, it seemed like I was reading its mind, and it was irritated with the dogs. That's what I thought, and it moaned again a second time. Same thing as before, about the same duration. And then the third time, it moaned again, but this time it was really, really loud, and it moaned for a real long time, and I was so scared I was afraid to go look. He retreated into his house and stayed there until the next morning, and he went out to investigate and did find what appeared to be footprints. So meanwhile, sightings continued. May 30th, 1979, Bill Iftiger was driving along U.S. Highway 395 outside of Yosemite when he saw an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot dash across the road in front of his car. In 1979, June, Shirley DeWolf and her family observed an 8-foot-tall Bigfoot walking right down 140th Street East, not far from their home in Lancaster. So there are times Bigfoot will approach suburban or even urban areas, though that's quite rare. And I will say again, Lancaster, while it is a very populated area, Lancaster, Quartz Hill, Antelope Valley, Acton, it's surrounded by large deserts and forests. So 1970s was a very active decade for Bigfoot, but the next 3 decades brought more reports. The area around Mount St. Helens has long been a Bigfoot hotspot. In the days following the eruption of Mount St. Helens in May of 1980, Betty Ann Almo and her friend observed a Bigfoot there on 3 separate occasions, and each time they said they saw this creature wandering through a walnut tree grove located along the Feather River. Bigfoot does appear to be omnivorous, and will eat both animals and fruits and whatever it can find. It was a few months later, on June 9, 1980, 2 gentlemen from Scotts Valley, Dave Wilhelm and Ben Larson, noticed a horrible garbage-like smell near their campsite, and going to investigate, they drove around the area slowly, and at one point they heard loud footsteps and heavy breathing, and suddenly a 12-foot-tall Bigfoot appeared in their headlights. The next day they returned and observed large footprints. So that seems to be the outer limit of how tall these Bigfoot get. You don't hear really any reports of anything over 12 feet tall. If they are, it's an outlier for sure. On September 3rd, 1980, Clyde Williams was driving through the Lake Hughes area late at night when he said a Bigfoot leapt right in front of his car and bounded quickly up a very steep mountainside. January 6th, 1981, an anonymous witness says he was hiking through the Angeles forest looking for Bigfoot tracks when he had an incredible encounter. As he searched, he suddenly heard this loud, almost metallic noise, he said. At the same time, all the animal sounds stopped, and looking around, he observed a large metallic saucer landed nearby, and looking to his left, he saw 2 tall, Bigfoot-type creatures in the distance. Both of these creatures were making long, loping strides directly towards him. He quickly snapped a photograph and ran away in a panic. Unfortunately, the photograph didn't really come out, and it was inconclusive. But again, another rare case of this weird Bigfoot UFO connection. In 1982, Marcy Honstead was in her home in Eureka, and she looked out her window and saw the head and shoulders of a Bigfoot. It quickly moved away. However, she was convinced forever that Bigfoot is real. And again, there are many accounts on record in which Bigfoot has approached densely populated urban areas. One such case occurred on the northwest end of the heavily populated San Fernando Valley, the Santa Susana Mountains. This is a little bit off from the homes in the valley, but I mean, this is very populated. Well over 1 million people live in the San Fernando Valley. And it was one evening in January of 1984 when two men were driving along the curvy mountain road of Santa Susana Pass when they said they encountered an 8-foot-tall, hairy creature standing in the road. Like other witnesses, they had to swerve to avoid the creature and actually crashed their all-terrain vehicle, at which point the creature quickly ran away. However, 1 month later, 3 hunters in the same general area said that they witnessed another, or perhaps the same, 8-foot-tall, hairy, man-like creature just walk right by their campsite. There's so many cases. In 1987, a group of retired firefighters were enjoying a volleyball game in the O'Brien campgrounds. This is near Mount Shasta Lake, when a Bigfoot walked through the nearby field, apparently oblivious to the human activity going around it. Here's a very interesting case, and it exhibits many of the details that are typical of Bigfoot behavior, and it's a very extensive encounter actually. It occurred in June of 1988. The witness was Sean Fries, who was camping alone in an isolated area along the Feather River in Northern California. And he says he had a pretty terrifying encounter. He was alone in his tent, his dogs were sleeping outside, and he woke up to find his dogs running into his tent, trembling in fear. Meanwhile, all the animal sounds, the crickets, and so forth had stopped. He grabbed his rifle, and overcoming his fear, he went outside of his tent to put more wood on the fire, and he said he had the sensation of being watched. And then, as Sean Fries says, and I quote, "I heard some very heavy footsteps right behind me in the trees." There was also a very strange odor, almost like a cross between a skunk and something dead. So he spun around, but whatever it was stayed out of his view in the thick forest. However, the encounter was not over yet. As Sean Fries says, this thing circled my camp all night long. So he stayed awake until it became light, but by the time morning arrived, he had had enough. He decided to leave immediately, but little did he know he was about to be chased by this creature. As Sean says, "At first light, I packed up and started out, and this thing followed me almost the entire day. I could smell it and even saw it through the woods about 75 yards from me, taking an almost parallel trail to me as if to make sure I left its territory." So it does appear that Bigfoot can be territorial. It was just a few months later, in August of 1988, when Todd Wilhelm was driving through the eastern Sierras, and he says he saw 2 Bigfoot cross the road in front of his vehicle. And in 1995, there was a case which got quite a bit of press attention, because this involved a filmmaker by the name of Craig Miller, who was filming a movie scene in the scenic Jedediah Smith Redwoods State Park. This is outside of Crescent City in Northern California. And he and his associate Colin Goddard were filming. Colin Goddard was the husband of a very well-known model, a Playboy model as a matter of fact, when they all noticed a Bigfoot and actually filmed it. Goddard was driving the crew in a large RV when he saw this 8-foot-tall, hairy, human-like form walking across the road in front of their vehicle. He shouted to Miller to look, and it was Miller who grabbed his video camera and managed to capture 5 seconds of video of the creature as it crossed the road and disappeared into the wilderness. This is not great footage, but with the eyewitness testimony that comes along with it, it's a pretty darn good case. So while most witnesses do catch only fleeting glimpses of Bigfoot at night, some do involve daylight sightings, and this following case may be unique in the Bigfoot literature. It occurred in August 1995. An anonymous couple from Pennsylvania had traveled to Northern California for a vacation. They rented a car, drove to various locations, and little did they know they were about to have a pretty dramatic Bigfoot encounter. It was very early one morning. They were driving outside of Crescent City, which has many Bigfoot encounters, as we have seen. They were driving along the coast when they spotted a beautiful beach. They stopped the car and were starting to get out and take a walk when, with no warning whatsoever, a Bigfoot showed up. As one of the witnesses says, and I quote, "I turned to see this big thing standing right in front of my car. At first I thought it was a bear until our eyes met. I couldn't move or speak. We just locked eyes for what seemed to be forever. It stood about 6.5 to 7 feet, dark brown matted hair, and was holding what looked to be seaweed, which it used both its hands to carry. It didn't seem startled. In fact, I felt it was looking at me with anger in its eyes. It let go a snort, and a glob of snot hit the windshield right in front of my face. It then took 3 or 4 steps and completely crossed the highway while still looking at me." So yeah, Bigfoot boogers. I don't know if that material was ever collected and studied. There was no follow-up on this case as far as I know, but I haven't heard of a case quite like it. At this point, another driver actually drove up, and they all watched this creature quickly bound off into the forest. And the main witnesses have all insisted upon complete anonymity. So while there are many reports of late-night drivers, probably the majority comes from campers and hikers and other people who are exploring their local wilderness area, such as in this next case. This occurred on August 4th, 1996, and this is a daylight sighting, 10 a.m., when several campers in the Inyo National Forest observed a Bigfoot from a distance of about 300 yards. They estimate it was about 8 or 9 feet tall, and it moved quickly along a nearby ridge. Often these creatures are seen walking along ridge tops or along rivers or along deer trails. In September of 1997, several reports came in from the Lake Crowley area. The first sighting was made by several campers who observed this creature while they were cooking their camp breakfast, but it was a few weeks later when several fishermen were fishing around dusk when they observed a Bigfoot looking back at them from the banks of the lake. As we have seen, the Mammoth Mountain Ski Resort area has produced a number of reports. One occurred in July of 1998 when several mountain bikers were biking along the base of Mammoth Mountain and observed a Bigfoot walking near the ski tram at the base of the mountain. On October 17, that same year, 1998, several campers in the Plumas National Forest area were woken up by the sound of a large bipedal creature walking around their campsite, and the next evening they heard a strange howling noise about 2 miles away, and all were convinced it was Bigfoot. A more recent case occurred in the town of Acton. I was able to interview the witness personally. She does not want her name used, but she reports that she had several encounters with a Bigfoot-like creature outside her home in Acton. This was in the summer of 2001. She wasn't the only witness. Several members of the home also observed the creature looking in through the window. Her roommate saw it, she did, and her young son saw it. One morning, she woke up to find chewed up animal bones on her doorstep. She thought that perhaps the Bigfoot had left it as a gift. They found freshly skinned animals. They found footprints. They've smelled odors, which they associate with the creature's presence. On one occasion, they heard a loud noise on the roof. And the next morning, they went up to investigate, and there was an enormous boulder perched on the top of the roof. Wendy had to get 2 full-grown men to move the boulder off of her house. And she says that on occasion, she felt that this creature was actually in telepathic contact with her. She asked me if there were any cases of Bigfoot kidnapping people, and I told her no. At the time, I was not really familiar with the Bigfoot literature. I did not know that there were that many cases of, people being grabbed by Bigfoot. Turns out there are, and she was worried about that. On another occasion, Wendy's son observed the Bigfoot climb the tree next to their home. There was a loud cracking sound as it broke several of the branches. And in fact, I saw this myself. And Wendy confirmed that several thick branches in the tree were snapped off, as did I, and there were large footprints. I conducted a long interview with Wendy. I talked to her son as well, and briefly with the other witnesses. And she said this went on for almost 3 years. She felt it was friendly, and she felt that it was kind of excited because it had found someone who could communicate telepathically with it. But by late 2003, she called to say that this Bigfoot was still around, and did I want to see it for myself? Because she thought she knew pretty much where it lived. My answer, of course, was yes. I had no idea that this would be successful, but I shouldn't have been surprised because she had taken my sister-in-law out Bigfoot hunting a few months earlier, and they both heard what they believed to be a bipedal creature bounding through the darkened forest towards them, but they became quite frightened and left. So at this time I was still new to Bigfoot and was a little bit skeptical. At any rate, it was clear to me after talking to Wendy that it was real. And in October 2003, Wendy and I hiked to a wilderness area a few miles from her home off the Angeles Crest Highway. We had just pulled off this road, a little dirt road, and we're getting out cameras and recording equipment. And Wendy pointed to this ravine and said that this is where she believed the Bigfoot lived. And suddenly there was a very loud, continuous growling noise off in the distance, coming directly from this deep forested valley directly to our east. We all stood still and looked at each other with wide eyes and, saying, "Did you hear that? What was that?" I mean, this was loud. I honestly thought it might be a jet coming overhead, but it clearly wasn't. We all listened, and it was just a few seconds later when we heard it again, a long, continuous, loud growling sound. It lasted for a good 5 seconds. I mean, this was loud, and by this time I could pretty much triangulate where it was coming from. It sounded almost like a chainsaw, but it was different. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a lion. Wendy screamed. She's like, "We're leaving now. I want to go away." Wendy is not her real name, by the way. That's a pseudonym. But she was quite frightened and insisted upon leaving. I was running towards it. But yeah, that's my Bigfoot encounter. We definitely heard something. I'm absolutely convinced it wasn't a mountain lion or a coyote or a bear or anything like that. I mean, this thing resonated in your chest. And I later found out that there was in fact a long history of sightings in that area. So this is a great place for any Bigfoot hunters to explore. There are more than 80 campgrounds located in the Angeles Forest National Park. Plenty of places to look for Bigfoot. And Lauren Coleman actually lists this area as one of the top spots in the world to contact Bigfoot. As he says, this area sees a lot of unusual Bigfoot activity, but it does not get much publicity, even though it is so close to Los Angeles. So it turns out that in 3 of the Bigfoot cases I've personally investigated, they all had a telepathic aspect to it. This is one of the reasons I do think Bigfoot is probably sentient and is psychically developed or advanced. So probably the best place to see a Bigfoot, if you're really interested in hunting them, is the town of Willow Creek in Northern California. This is surrounded by huge redwood forests, and it's easy to see why it's a Bigfoot hotspot. This is very much close to Bluff Creek, and each Labor Day they have a big annual Bigfoot celebration. I mean, I could go on and on with further accounts all the way up to the present day, but I think it's getting a little bit repetitive, so I'm just going to wrap it up here. But as you can see, Bigfoot is all across California. There you go. That's the history of Bigfoot in California. I did write about this in my book, Supernatural California. I also wrote an entire book about Bigfoot. This was actually written for children. It's called Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Ape Men, and that's a more general book covering the entire planet. But in Supernatural California, I presented the California history of Bigfoot. And yeah, I'm absolutely convinced this is real, that there is a hairy hominin wandering through the forests of our state here in California, but across the United States and the world. It's my opinion that we're probably dealing with ancestors of the Neanderthals who have been with us all along but have remained largely undetected. I do believe they're intelligent. I think there are psychic aspects to these beings who have very developed psychic abilities. This is just my opinion based on some of the more paranormal type encounters that people have described to me personally. But you've seen the evidence for yourself. You can make up your own mind. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I really want to thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for answers, keep looking for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun.